Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation. I'm really thrilled to have Patrick Collison join us. He's founder and CEO of Stripe. And this is a company that I got to know during COVID, actually. You might say, how did I find out? Because it wasn't that we were using Stripe as a service, but we were introduced and we spent some time talking about biotechnology. He has a keen interest in getting involved in supporting and advancing science in the biomedical fields, and we exchanged ideas. He really made me feel old because I actually had to sound wise in responding to his questions. And I'm really looking forward to having this discussion because he really is quite an unusual talent, both in entrepreneurship, but also caring a lot about the scientific enterprise. And he and his foundation have done a lot to support this, and I really want to get into that. So welcome, Patrick.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with a legend of biotech.
Oh, well, legend in my own mind, anyway. So let's dive in. I want the audience to hear from you a little bit about how you got interested in this area, in this topic. Obviously, it has impact, but lots of things have impact. And then, segue into the ARC Institute, what it does, how it functions, and how it's become a platform over time, and how it's changed.
Sure. Well, in really short terms, my brother and I, we started this technology company called Stripe 15 years ago. And Stripe builds what we call economic infrastructure for the internet. And so programmable tools that help businesses move money globally, actually turn a product into a business and to scale to hundreds of countries. And Stripe started out serving entrepreneurs and developers. So there are lots of big enterprise platforms, but we thought that there are lots of interesting things happening at the edges. They sometimes want, they want to do things in some novel way. The status quo was not necessarily adequate for them, and they care about different things. Like they really care about the barriers to entry and complexity and how easy something is to set up and so forth. So anyway, started in 2010. Businesses like DoorDash, Instacart, Shopify, these giants that, or at least, well, today giants that at the time were these nascent little efforts were our first customers, and now Stripe serves several million customers. But that kind of initial bias in Stripe towards entrepreneurs and developers is very much at the heart of the company, and we think a lot about what determines whether somebody pursues an idea, which idea they pursue, what makes an idea succeed or not, like that kind of essence of creation. When I was in college, I thought I wanted to be a scientist. And I studied math and physics, and college can be a great experience. In my particular case, I learned that I wasn't good enough to be a world-leading mathematician or a physicist. So that was very valuable. And I decided to pursue software and entrepreneurship instead, but I was still very interested in science. And I actually told my girlfriend of the time, now wife, that if Stripe really worked, I'd like to figure out some way to start a new kind of biology or science research organization. And so fast forward, in 2021, so 11 years into Stripe, we decided, my wife and I, to start an organization called the ARC Institute. And the ARC Institute, I mean, we can go into any detail you want, but the sort of very short summary is we fund scientists on renewable 8-year terms. So rather than being on the grant treadmill and having to pursue something that's that you can make a high confidence case for, instead to be able to pursue something somewhat more exploratory. And then secondly, at ARC, we build infrastructure platforms. But half the scientists work on these core platforms for things like computation or obviously AI, but cellular models or better imaging technology, like things kind of beyond the scale of what any individual academic lab can easily establish for itself. So those are kind of the two premises: these platforms and these 8-year grants, or excuse me, programs that enable curiosity-oriented research. And so I'd say across both Stripe and ARC, the central essence is this question of the dynamics of creation and new ideas and how people make them successful. And in both cases, we want to build platforms that maximize the probabilities there.
Great introduction. Maybe give us just a little better sense, because the audience may not know as much about ARC as it exists today.
Yeah.
How many grantees are there, and roughly what's the size of the ecosystem that's growing around it?
Sure. So ARC is about 300 people today. There are 12 core labs. And ARC operates in partnership with UCSF, Stanford, and Berkeley. And so all of the core investigators at ARC also have an appointment at one of those 3 partner universities. And we think that's very important because to be a vital, vibrant research organization, you want to have grad students, you want to be embedded inside the sort of research ecosystem of these other places. Actually, around this time last year, we released Evo 2, which was, I guess, was at the time and still is the largest biology ML model ever trained. It's a DNA language model, and we trained that in partnership with NVIDIA. And I was pretty excited to see that because I think it's kind of a validation of this idea that there are some ideas that are valuable to pursue that are kind of hard to do, again, circumscribed to the narrow boundaries of what's possible, on a single R01 or something like that. I think with everything that's happening today, there's some bigger things possible.
And is it kind of like some of the other research institutes co-located? Is there a lot that people do together, or are they all individuals?
It's very much, everyone's very excited these days about remote work and distributed collaboration and so forth. In the ARC context, we really believe in having people together, and so everyone's in a single building. It's in Palo Alto, next to Stanford. And the other thing I guess I should just mention in giving this kind of high-level description, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is one of the motivations for ARC is, you can maybe coarsely divide disease, obviously, into infectious and monogenic and complex, whatever. There's lots of different ontologies, but we've obviously, as a species, as a civilization, we've made pretty great progress against the infectious diseases, or at least the most problematic of them. We at least have strategies for dealing with the monogenic diseases and screening and whatever. For complex diseases, you can debate a little bit maybe the definition of a cure, but you can at least make the case that we've never cured a complex disease. And obviously, the big killers today are neurodegenerative diseases and still CVD and cancer and so forth. All these complex diseases, autoimmune, whatever. And I guess I'm curious to get your take on this. If the last, maybe you can characterize the last 70 years as being one of amazing progress in infectious diseases and strong progress, if we're being generous, in ameliorating some of these complex conditions, but nothing that we can readily say or we can clearly say is a cure flat out. What do you think the next 50 years? Well, do you agree that that's a reasonable way to characterize the landscape, first off, and then second, in as much as it is, what do you think the next 20 years look like?
Super. So as a warning to the audience, unlike many of our other discussions, this is going to be a back and forth of questions. So if you're wondering if Patrick is going off script, asking me a question, and worse yet, I'm actually answering it off script, that I should have said in the introduction, that's what we're doing. So look, I've been involved in this kind of innovation in biotech and health, human health, for now 39 years. And one thing I could take away from it if I stopped doing it today would be it's remarkable how much we've done by knowing so little. And I'd say we now know a lot more than we did before, and we also know that we know even less of what there is to know than we thought in the beginning. So it's a little bit like, a mountain, the peak of which you can't see, and the clouds as far as you can see it. And once you go up the mountain, you realize actually it's a much, much bigger mountain, and so you're nowhere in a way. It's remarkable how much practical things we've done despite that. That's human ingenuity, and essentially we found ways to create micro understanding on little things that either at the biochemical level or at the cell level, and we've done all amazing things to it with lots of unintended consequences and side effects and etc. So, for example, we'd like to believe, somebody came up with the lock and key analogy, and since then we go around saying lock and key, lock and key, lock and key. The reality is our keys open lots of locks and doors, and many other keys can open the same doors, and so it's a bit of a mess. I think that's reality. So despite that, rather than waiting for complete understanding the way physicists would have probably preferred to do it, people have just said, you know what, people are dying, people need to be treated, let's just do better and better. And this whole enterprise with hundreds of billions of dollars of research has been built on that compromised way of advancing with relatively little knowledge. Now, to your point, what is likely to change? Good news is I won't be doing this in 20 years. I'm not very much of a longevity aficionado, and so I can make lots of predictions that I don't have to be accountable for. And the prediction I would make is that the biggest impact we'll have is in creating models of human biology, physiology, the complex systems that we are, bigger and bigger ones, and I don't mean by that just kind of a number of parameters, but I mean bigger and bigger at scale, and begin to use that to make more predictable and more precise interventions. I think that is clearly the promise that we have. So what began at the beginning 25 years ago with human genome sequencing that was supposed to cure all immediately is now beginning to be the first layer of the stack of things you need. And I think this EVO2 model is a great thing. We were with Jensen Huang last night when they had this affair with this event with Lilly, and he talked about EVO2 among the things that they felt very proud of. So I think that the AI-driven revolution in science is going to be interesting. And to that end, I'll just mention.
So you think it's real? There's lots of naysayers and skeptics, but
I think there's lots of skeptics and naysayers about the role AI will have in lots of other fields. Fortunately, I don't know anything about those fields. But if there are actually skeptics about what the role AI can have in the scientific enterprise, I don't think they have enough data to support their argument, and we do. We at Flagship have worked in this area for about 7 years. So long before there were AlphaFolds and lots of the more recent generative AI. And so by trial and error, we've kind of seen what a learning system can do. And I'll tell you kind of at a high level, because we haven't had a chance to talk about this, my kind of conclusion and my premise that we put out last year is this notion of polyintelligence, which is, if you look out 50 years, I think what's going to happen is that humans will coexist with two other forms of intelligence that we will not understand. One is artificial intelligence, and the other is nature's intelligence. And all the forms of nature's intelligences, whether it's a virus that can take down humanity or a tree that every 50 years blooms, these things are things that we have nowhere near the sophistication, complexity of engineering today, but we will begin to create models for them. So humans will not need to understand to emulate using artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, and nature's intelligence. And those two, as they reveal each other, will be the new challenge for humans. How do you conduct that process? That's what I think will have profound effect on better medicines, better cures, better vaccines, prophylactics. It really is going to be a very interesting time.
I don't want to totally usurp your interview and your stage here, but if I've asked, so that's a very optimistic take on what's to come. If I was to then jump to the kind of countervailing pessimistic sentiment and mood, the latest figures are, but something like 40% of new drug candidates are being developed in China, and there are many prognosticators with apocalyptic tones talking about the biotech sector in the US and whether it is viable today, whether it will remain viable. Maybe you could also say that the rise of China is in fact a very good thing, it'll grow the sector as a whole. Just what are your views?
Well, I put out this letter this week in which I mentioned this as part of the good times and the bad times we're living in at the same time. I think competition from China is both a good thing and a threat. It's a good thing in that it's coming at a time when we seem to be losing our way in relying on the scientific method and arguing based on facts instead of opinions, all of which this kind of science-based policymaking is how we got here, in a positive sense of the word. And there seems to be an erosion in that anywhere you look, you'll find, whether it's low, the same 40% could be applied to the proposed funding cuts at NIH, whether it's cutting visas for people like you and for me to come to this country, to join universities, to join private enterprise. All of that suggests that there's somehow an undoing of the reliance on the scientific method and its outputs as a way to create more prosperous, more secure society. In a funny way, the rise of the Chinese investment in the very same method and output is a good reminder that imagine if we stopped doing it and nobody was doing it, in which case we'd kind of go, well, we'll just take our time and we might change our mind later. That we don't have the luxury of, and that's the alarming part. I think the not so good part is that it is the case that it's not a level playing field. It hasn't been in many industries, and it isn't in our industry. And I do think that there is something to be said about looking carefully at the precondition for collaboration. To me, is fair competition. In other words, I wouldn't collaborate with people that are then going to not compete fairly. So where there are opportunities to improve the competitive landscape, whether it's IP related, whether it's how clinical trials are done, whether it's access to data that is available but only to local companies, all that stuff I think should be factored in. But overall, I think we can't as a country but welcome competition, because this country made it based on its ability to compete. But I think we need to ensure that we're not kind of changing some of our principles at the same time as we're seeing the rise of this thing. So let's come back to kind of what you've been doing in this area. It really is fascinating that your day job and this other day job, I suppose, because I'm sure you need to get some sleep, is so impactful. I'm thinking here, I'm singing and thinking, well, this institute that you're building, how have you thought about it in the longer term, if you have? Obviously, you have an institute where the sun sets. You might think about an institute where the sun rises. By that, I don't mean in China. I mean in East Coast. So you could imagine this as a model for kind of a way to think about scientific enterprise. But maybe say, what are your early observations of the impact of the 8-year cycles and these platforms, and how could that be institutionally grown?
Well, a couple of thoughts. So even before the sun rises in the East Coast, it rises in Ireland. So maybe that's the logical place for expansion. But
Boston East.
So yeah, ARC is now just over 4 years old, and mostly I feel it's premature to be extracting any major definitive lessons from that which has happened so far. We're definitely cautiously encouraged, and something that's quite striking is that 4 years ago, or say 5, when we were just starting to think about this, it really felt like the shape of the research enterprise in the US, the formula for it, at least at the basic science level, but maybe also at the translational level, was pretty well established. And it didn't feel like there was that much de novo structural thinking about, well, how should we just change the overall edifice here? And both in good ways and in bad ways, it feels to me that there's a lot more beginner's mind today and a lot more openness to new ways of doing things. And that's partly because of AI, it's partly because of disruptions and some of the issues that have faced universities. It's because of the rise of China we're just discussing. But there's lots of things happening. But in general, the aperture feels it feels like people are more open-minded. To your point about simulation, we're, from a kind of scientific goal standpoint, we're very focused on two things. So one is we, to this complex disease point, we want to test our ability to marshal our different capabilities against complex diseases generally, and Alzheimer's in particular. Alzheimer's both being a huge disease burden in its own right, but also the archetypal complex disease. And again, I think it's premature to render any verdict, but I'd say 4 years in, I'm sort of cautiously optimistic about the progress being made there. Though obviously a lot of lot of hopes have been dashed on the rocks of Alzheimer's. So who knows? But then the other thing to your AI point is we're working on a virtual cell. And again, 2 years ago when we started to work on this, we weren't at least aware of anybody else pursuing this. Now, obviously, there are a couple of efforts, which, by the way, is great to see. Like, it'll just, first and foremost, be an amazing day for humanity if and when somebody really gets this to work, although it's probably not a single binary thing. But our intuition is very much the same as yours, where if we ask ourselves, well, Nixon declared the war on cancer in the early 70s, we're here in 2026 and cancer is not cured, why not? Obviously, you can answer that question at lots of different abstraction levels, but one way we think about it as well, a typical biology experiment costs, if you round to orders of magnitude, six months and $100,000, just like a typical experiment. And so if you think about it, serially, how many stacked end to end, how many biology experiments we've gotten to do over the 55 years or whatever since the war on cancer was declared. It's on the order of 100 sequential experiments, and that's obviously not a lot. And when you compare that to obviously the computational world, where you can run maybe 1 million experiments in a couple of hours or something, it's just such a different regime. And so obviously it's an open question whether we can build something with sufficient predictive accuracy and sufficient ability to generalize and so forth. And we'll see. But we want to build a perturbational model of gene expression at the level of individual cells, on the theory that that'll provide sufficient insight for guiding hypotheses that then you can make your actual wet lab work an awful lot more efficient. Hopefully that works. Whether or not it does, I think you're exactly right that sort of figuring out these computational accelerants for some of the most binding bottlenecks is just going to be a very big deal. And I guess speaking of bottlenecks, something I was kind of curious to hear your thoughts on is there's a really interesting book by, actually I'm curious if anybody here has read it, by James LaFanu, The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine. Okay, I'm seeing at least one head nod. And he kind of characterizes mid-century medical and biomedical research as one of, in good and bad ways, very freewheeling experimentation. And it's good in that lots of amazing discoveries ensued, and then it's bad in that lots of people were also injured, perhaps with experiments that were not very well thought through. And then we kind of transitioned to a very rational era, and it works, but it's slow and expensive and so forth. And in that rational era, one of the things that is slowest and most expensive is clinical trials. And so Flagship is in some way a machine for generating approved drugs, and by proceeding through all the different steps that go into that. And I'm curious how much you think about or care about clinical trials. And I guess it's easy to think about the really scientifically compelling stuff about how we can do better target ID or how we can do better validation or whatever. But then there's the maybe less glamorous stuff about how we do trial recruitment more efficiently, or whether we can merge stages, or I don't know. Any. So how much does the less glamorous, more bureaucratic stuff matter, and how much do you care about trials in particular?
So I would say it's changed, and it's changing over time, because we started out making these gigantic leaps and creating new modalities and new molecules, new biological discoveries, many of them. And when you're doing that, you tend kind of to, it's a little bit like, not to use a crude analogy, literally excusing the pun, of oil. The question is, do you focus on finding new reservoirs, or do you focus on better refining techniques? And certainly the clinical trials always sound like refining, even though it's actually the holdup and it's a very expensive thing. So I would say we've been less focused on that because we were far away from that. Now, so many years later, we have a lot of drugs that are kind of advancing, and our companies do. And so we do see these inefficiencies as a bottleneck, in the sense that even if we were able to dramatically revolutionize the input into the pipeline of disruptive new molecules, if they all just kind of back up and die on the way out, that's a real limitation. So indeed, it's not a question of glamorous, it's almost existential that this be changed. Now, at the same time...
Do you think trials can be made 10x cheaper?
I believe they can be made 10x cheaper by definition because they're not this expensive for any logical reason. I mean, in other words, it's a little bit, I would argue that there's a similarity between the way the payer, insurance, and patient dilemma works, in that the beneficiary isn't the one making the decision. I think there's a little bit of that in the clinical trial decision-making process, in the sense that if a pharma's doing it, if your expectation is I get a drug approved, I have a monopoly for a period of time and it's going to be super valuable, you don't want to do anything that will jeopardize being able to get there. And yet innovation, which exposes you to a little bit of risk, is what you need to do to get there. So I'd say large companies that really care about this have done better and better jobs. Companies like Merck, companies like Lilly have over time come up with savvy ways of doing it. But by and large, I think people don't dare, I will say this way, in a regulated industry, do much. Now, the interesting thing is that in China, where you can do physician-sponsored trials and they're being done by the thousands, and therefore it becomes uncompetitive for the US not to have that kind of human data, and data-driven kind of patient targeting, etc. These things are going to enter into it. So yes, it's absolutely a necessity to transform that. You do need a collaborative regulator, or two or three. We see that in MHRA. We're seeing that a little bit in Singapore now. We've done some partnerships with them to allow that to happen. Because if a regulator says, feel free to change things, I won't tell you if I agree with them until you bring me the file at the end, nobody's going to change things. During COVID, ironically, when the relatives and the spouses of the FDA regulators were dying, boy, did they say, not go ahead and do whatever you want, but let me help you figure out what is okay regulatorily so you can advance. So what the unfortunate lesson people have not understood during COVID is not that shortcuts were taken, because they were not. We did 30,000 subject trials, as did Pfizer. We did a more rigorous vaccine trial than any vaccine trial pretty much that had been done. But we had a collaborative regulator that said, I want something to come out. What is disappointing is, why have we stopped at that? Why can't we say we want something to come out that works in Alzheimer's, and we want one part of the FDA, particularly for places where we don't have any effective treatments, like people did with cancer, although they're kind of backing off of that now too, to just have a mechanism for people to be encouraged to get the collaboration, breakthrough designations, et cetera. So I do think this is an important thing. I think any automation, data-driven decision-making there would be key, and it can only help the upstream stuff, so for sure.
If you became SAR of the biomedical research enterprise in the US, and you can change anything from basic funding mechanics and grant making to the universities, all the way through to the patent regime and IP, clinical trials, drug reimbursement, insurance, insofar as the government, is directly involved, you have complete authority over the full end-to-end continuum. What are the top things you change?
Well, first, what I would do is I'd hire people like you and others and make sure that I have people who are going to be around to see the change, kind of collaborate. I mean it a little bit seriously. I think that this would be the job of a team of people who would really take on the balancing act, because I would worry about any czar in any context making these decisions, because most people make decisions expediently and seemingly arbitrarily sometimes when they have to do that. So that much power I would invest in myself for sure, but I think there is a way to do something useful. So I know the point of your question is, okay, so what should be done? I think in every one of these areas there is work we can do, which is, look, I'm, just to take a step back, I describe my mindset, as a pathology, probably as a paranoid optimist. I'm constantly toggling between believing what I think and doubting what I think. That same mindset is the way I would think about reform or transformation, which is the paranoid side kind of says, whoa, wait a minute, there's a reason we're doing this. What are we going to change it? The optimistic part says, yeah, but if we don't change it, or if we do change it, it could get a lot better. I would apply that to the regulatory process. I would think about, and I've said this before, although again, fortunately, I don't have any standing in the regulatory world. I would think about what kind of pivotal trials we need to potentially get drugs out there that are really needy in places that have no treatment. Rare diseases are a good example of that. But there may be other areas where there's just nothing, in which you could think about a partial approval with heavy-duty supervision before complete approval, and what might you get companies to agree to do in terms of pricing for those drugs, right? So a drug that's shown to be safe, whose efficacy is provisionally shown and will be shown even more later, So these are things, again, these are just one-off examples. We should take the 10 best ideas and run some pilots. We have enough cases. I think there's a bunch of things as well on the reimbursement side, which we don't have the time to get into, and that's even less something I know about. But I do think that we're going to keep seeing healthcare costs go up and up and up if we don't make these tough societal decisions. Unfortunately, I think societies usually change when things break, and then they have to change. And things haven't quite broken; they've just gotten super expensive. So I think that. So let's come back to you have this dual life, and I'd love to get a sense from you. Have you watched the biotech industry, which is kind of the usual way in which the innovations come to life in this industry? What are observations you're making from the kind of company you run, which might seem like a different company, but it's a knowledge-based value creation engine, just like any other biotech company should be? How have you seen the differences, and what might there be from your world that could be brought into bear for how biotechnology is done?
Founders in Silicon Valley are rarely accused of being, too humble and too slow to offer their opinion in domains they are not familiar with and have no expertise in. So, ARC does basic research. We have not, ARC is not a biotech company, and we've not tried to bring any drugs through the sort of translational process. And so, in that sense, I just want to emphasize my lack of expertise here. The exposure we have is, we ran a program during COVID, which, as you say, is when we first met, called Fast Grants, where we noticed that NIH and NSF were surprisingly slow off the starting blocks to make new grants or to approve repurposing of existing grants for COVID-related work. And so we ended up making around 200 grants just for kind of basic research across institutions around the world. But some of those we actually ended up working quite closely with some biotech companies. And then obviously for ARC, we've hired from biotech, and some of the PIs at ARC have also started companies and so forth. The big thing that strikes me, and I don't really know what to do about this, but just seems like a very fundamental difference is, at Stripe, we push ourselves so much to think about the long term. Now, you can't use the long term as kind of an excuse to just be slow. It's like you're kind of paranoid optimists. We try to be exceptionally impatient, but also really thinking about what the world is going to look like and where we want to be in 10 plus years time. We talk a lot at Stripe about multi-decade abstractions, because the abstractions and APIs we built back in 2010 are still with us today 15 years later. So it's already a decade and a half, and I'm sure they will last well into Stripe's third decade. Whereas with biotech, it really feels that you just don't have that luxury, right? And everything is so much about the next gauntlet and the next validation step, and that you live such a precarious existence where you're always just one trial result or a series of adverse events or whatever away from, in some sense, the whole company conceivably not being viable. And again, that's obviously to a substantial extent intrinsic to just the nature of what we're doing here. So I don't obviously see kind of a better way, but that difference is very striking, and maybe it's an argument for platform companies or companies with some degree of diversification, so that there's less embedded precarity or something like that. But I think I don't know how to build a really successful organization where everything is so compressed and there is the sense of that, always the sense of that precipice. And to some extent, part of what impresses me so much about Flagship is that obviously you guys have figured out an approach and an algorithm and a series of recipes, I guess, you guys number the companies, right, as opposed to naming them until you've achieved and gotten to sufficient confidence that there is actually something of durability there. So anyway, that really jumps out. And then I suppose the other thing, and actually I'm again curious if you guys have come up with solutions here, but we've come across so many cases of biotech companies that have done some really awesome science. I think even the biotech companies that fail, I think, at least in almost every case I'm familiar with, they've done some really cool work, right? I mean, people started the company for a reason, people funded it for a reason, people worked in it for years for a reason. It's not just, even if it failed, it's not just stupid. But we don't really have a systematic way to release that back into the commons if the company doesn't work out. And that to me seems like such a tragedy, right? Where maybe data that was generated or collected just fades away into the ether, or maybe discoveries that were made, or process knowledge that was acquired. And so, I'm sure you've seen 100 times more of this than I have, but of the companies that didn't work out, I often feel this sense of cosmic tragedy that the important and useful things that did happen are somehow not going to be readily built upon by others.
Yeah.
So those are the main two things that jump out to me.
So very, very good. So I would say you're right in that a little bit of this speaks to what Flagship's trying to do, because we've been involved in the founding of now 122, I think is our number, the most recent numbers, entities, and a whole bunch of ones that on the way to being formed.
Okay, so I've started 0 biotech company, and you've started 122.
Well, Flagship has. But what I'm saying is, in an interesting way, Flagship is an antidote to this, at least as it relates to the 122 companies, because the excruciating pain was felt by people who are still at Flagship. Starting with me, but a whole bunch of people who've been here 10, 15, 20 years. And so the institutional memory that we have, the experiences, the kind of bad stories or painful stories is omnipresent for sure. We constantly try to figure out how to get better at encoding it and passing it forward, but boy, do we kind of benefit from that. And it's a little like a serial entrepreneur. See, interestingly, in biotech, things take so long that most people who succeed would never do it again. And so the people who succeed in flipping an asset in a year or two, which does not really expose you to learning how to actually build a company, it just kind of allows you to move an asset forward, that you get to do. But then the next one might not work, and it says nothing about how good an entrepreneur you are because it's just the asset. But I think that we have institutionalized the serial entrepreneurship advantage because we're doing parallel entrepreneurship, and so the information can flow in real time. And so but that doesn't give us access to the thousands of companies that have been started at the same time. It would be interesting to codify it. I don't know, I would worry that people would not use it as a heuristic because they think it's very context dependent, which it often is. Yeah. But you're right, there are generalities, and I'd like to think part of our advantage is that.
If one of your companies doesn't work out, do you have any systematic step before everybody walks away to structure and put in the Flagship library the things that were discovered so that somebody can?
Yeah. We've talked about this a number of times. We've even done kind of post-mortem case studies, which we're beginning to capture. In fact, one of our, the chief strategist at Flagship was a former Harvard Business School professor, great guy, Gary Pisano, who joined us, left Harvard as one of the top HBS kind of vice deans, and then he joined us to do this. He's actually been using AI kind of in this stage of his career to try to extract and try to write cases that would essentially captivate that tough moment decision. We've got a long way to go, but we're at least doing it, and I think we will accelerate. Once we unleash it, there's probably 100 of these that we can do. So that's a definite learning environment.
I suppose the other thing I think that with respect to biotech is San Francisco is a very strong default answer for where a super talented person anywhere in the world should go, and benefits from this tremendous influx every year, and tech, in some sense, it's kind of an easy domain in which to get started, and it's in some sense, it's quite meritocratic. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of luck involved, but there aren't a lot of gatekeepers, and it's possible to acquire a lot of the domain knowledge and the tacit knowledge and so forth via many different routes.
Yep.
Biotech is, and biomedical research generally, it's much more regimented and it's much more striated. And if you didn't get your PhD at a top institution and so forth, there aren't really a lot of entry paths. And I think you should be careful here because it is also extremely complicated, and so it's not like you can just waltz in and expect to start making massive discoveries. But I do think about how it takes a long time to get into a position where you can be effective and be credible in this domain, and it's just very hard, and things take a long time. And so part of me just wonders, what can we do about that? Not for the goal of making drug discovery faster and better, though of course we want those too, but what can we do about it to make it a more hospitable place for super talented people? Because for an 18-year-old, they might be choosing between the tech ladder and the biology ladder. Obviously we're fortunate where a lot of very brilliant people do choose the biology ladder, and we all then benefit from the ensuing discoveries. But if you think of kind of the relative weights and the relative payoffs and how long it takes to do something important, I just think that those relative assessments matter. And biology, it's just given how hard it is and how self-sacrificing you have to be, I think as a society we should feel overwhelming gratitude that as many brilliant people opt into it as do. But there's a bit of a question as to, are there ways we can just make it easier?
I think it's a great observation. We're going to have to wrap up. Let me just add a couple of closing thoughts to what you just raised, which is giving me lots of great imagery in my mind. I've always viewed biotechnology equivalent to what mammalian cells do, and tech as bacteria, in that they divide every 25 minutes. And so the number of cycles you can get through in tech, and the learning cycles, and the DNA in a bacteria learns at such a massive rate. It's no wonder that people would rather be in that cycle time than in cells. But
it's a great analogy. I think that's exactly the virtual cell thing we were discussing.
Exactly. So I think that's one thing to think about. And but the promise and I think the optimism for me comes in making one small and stark realization that you should also think about. The original information technology is biology. It came long before computers and silicon, and it is a complete information technology. It happens to use DNA as a storage medium. It's an absolute reinforcement learning system, and there's no way that it's not a form of intelligence given how it comes about. And so when this becomes an information technology field, I actually am quite optimistic that it will become fragmentable in a meaningful way. People will be able to do sub-components of this and basically collect things together. There'll be interoperability discussions, and the models are a good starting point for that. All of that has been absent. This has been fiercely by biologists possessed as some magical, complex thing. And I think once the information science, information technology nature of it is fully revealed, and I think AI is going to help us do that, it will be much more accessible. And in fact, you'll go back to your initial ambition to do science, because you will be as good, if not better, looking at it from the IT, information science standpoint, and not as some black magic. So with that, we're going to end the discussion. Thanks a lot for doing this, Patrick.
Thank you.
And look forward to talking some more. Thank you.
Really fun.